All right, today on Idiot with a Library Card, I'm going to be talking about Sherlock Holmes short stories in general, because I've now read 37 Sherlock Holmes short stories. And I would say that they come in a varying degree of quality, but there aren't a lot of bad ones, and there are some really good ones. So that's today on Idiot with a Library Card. Sherlock Holmes short stories. And patterns within them. And I'd like to say today's show is brought to you by, I'm going to say Zycan, although I don't sound great and sound a little transvestite-y, if that's still an acceptable word. Just getting over a cold. Wanted to record this, but I probably wanted to record this last week, but I just couldn't wait anymore, and this cold was not getting any better. So sorry about the voice, and this isn't some lady who's smoked a lot. It's me. So as I was saying, I've read 3 collections of Sherlock Holmes short stories. The first one was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The second one was The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And the third one was The Return of Sherlock Holmes. And I'd have to say, of the 3, thus far, I think The Return of Sherlock Holmes is the best. I liked The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And I think part of the problem, and I'll get into this, is, again, I've read 37 of these. But the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes was the first short story collection I read. And for the most part, I did a ranking on the ones I like the best. It's a really solid collection of short stories. The second one, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, there were a few problems there. And this is why I didn't do a show on it, is that the stories, if you read, and I would say one collection at a time is probably best. If you read 2 collections at a time, what happens is the stories start to bleed together. And so it was just hard for me to do a comprehensive or even a competent review of that, just because I was sort of rushing through the stories, and I would read it, and if I had to then explain what happened to someone, I could, but I'd really meander through it and have to figure it out. I got a break, because between that one and The Return of Sherlock Holmes, which I read, was The Hounds of Baskerville, and that was a nice break to get into a long-form Sherlock Holmes story. But I didn't want to get into all the short stories in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes and The Return of Sherlock Holmes. I'll talk a little bit about a few of the stories, but I kind of wanted to just talk about the general patterns and setups of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And it's interesting because after you read so many, I would say after about 12, you start to get a sense of the formula. And it is a formula. It's basically a plug-and-play formula that Arthur Conan Doyle uses. It reminds me a lot of like a Law and Order, where there's a new case each week. And not so much like a True Detective or a The Wire, where it's one case through the whole show. It was like sort of compared that to the novels of Sherlock Holmes, and the short story collections are more like Law and Order. It's like, a new case comes in, and you sort of follow it all the way through. So what is the general formula? I split it into 3 parts. Part 1 is a client comes to the house with an odd problem, or it's the police come to the house, 221B Baker Street, and everyone's sort of surprised that someone's there. But it's the client introduction has a certain beat to it. It's actually usually pretty quick. It makes up maybe the first page, 7 to 15 page story, and it goes into the history, and they describe what happened. Usually Sherlock Holmes puts his fingers all together, like almost like in prayer, but all the tips are touching. And sometimes it describes him as like sitting in his chair in a squat sort of position, so his feet are also on the the butt part of the chair. And then he just tells them to talk, and they explain their problem. And this happens in almost every Sherlock Holmes story. Sometimes what happens, there's a change in which like the police say, oh, you got to come with us and check this out. And then he'll do the interview there. But basically you get a narrative of what happened by one of the characters. It's usually the client, sometimes the police. But you get a outlay of this is what seems to have happened. And generally, the next phase of the story is Sherlock Holmes being kind of bored with the problem and not that interested, but then starting to feel out that there's something weird going on, and then his interest is piqued and he gets into the case. There's also an idea in a lot of the stories that he immediately or very quickly has an idea of what happened. He's not a guesser. He doesn't like theories. He'll go on sort of a thought trail. He'll go on a thought trail and follow it where it leads him, and it usually leads him in the right direction. And then the last part of the story seems to be that Sherlock Holmes doesn't just come out and say, you did it, and this is how you did it, and this is why you did it, and figures out. What he generally does is he sets a trap for people, and they fall into the trap, and that's how he proves the crime. And then the crime unfolds. It's funny because it's not something you would do if you were an actual detective. You'd probably just say what happened and then work on collecting evidence to prove that. But instead, he does it that way, honestly, because it's narratively better, because you get to go on the trip with him, and then when there's that twist at the end, you're surprised too, instead of him saying, no, I think it was that person, the person you didn't suspect. I think it's that person, and this is why it's that person. Instead, there's a trap set, and then the person you don't suspect falls into the trap, and boom, it's over and done, and that person is caught and maybe going to jail, or maybe Sherlock will be like, you murdered someone, but he was kind of a bad guy, and so I don't really care. And by the way, that happens a lot, especially in this last collection of stories. There's 2 stories where people straight up get murdered by people, and Sherlock Holmes just shrugs his shoulders and goes, when he catches the person, he shrugs his shoulders and goes, you probably shouldn't have murdered that person, but they were kind of a bad person, so I'm not gonna go to the police with this. It happens in earlier stories, but generally doesn't happen with a murder. So the other problem with this project, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is the Hounds of Baskerville actually pulled me back in again. I read the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I was digging the short stories, and then I read the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, which I think I have to actually go back and read again. I would probably enjoy them with a little time taken away, but reading 12 stories in a row it's not daunting, but it can get not interesting, and there's a formula there, and so you can get kind of bored. It's like binge watching Law and Order, which you can do, but there's a certain amount of like the judge is going to allow it. The judge is going to say, I'll allow it, and you're just like, oh my God, please. So yeah, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, those stories really bled together, and I took my time with the return of Sherlock Holmes. I took each story a little slower, and what you realize is there are some really good stories, and then there's forgettable stories. I actually, in this particular collection, I thought all the stories were pretty good, but when I had just finished and I was prepping for the show, I just went through the list of the stories again to look, and I knew I wasn't going to do like a ranking like I did for the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I was just going to kind of talk about Sherlock Holmes short stories in general and what I've gleaned from them. There were when I read through the list, I was like, oh yeah, that was a great one, that was a good one, and then I'd read other ones and I'd have to think back and went, what happened in that? What was that a story? What was that? So yeah, there's ones that are good, and you'll remember, and then there's some forgettable ones. Just like Law & Order. I'm really comparing it to Law & Order. There's some really solid episodes of Law & Order, and then there's some forgettable ones. Or another show I really like is Monk, and that has a much more Sherlock Holmes feeling. And there's some really good Monk episodes that you know, when you think of Monk, you think of those episodes and go, oh, that was a great episode. But then there's ones that if you're on TV, it would come on, and you'd be like, oh, yeah, I remember this episode. I'm fat and lazy. I'm not going to change the channel. But this isn't my favorite one. I'll maybe focus on something else and think about what I'm going to talk about on my Sherlock Holmes podcast. So that's sort of the formula of the short stories generally is client explains crime, Sherlock Holmes does a little investigating but has a general idea of what happened, Sherlock Holmes sets trap, guilty party falls into trap, and then Sherlock Holmes makes a decision, a moral decision on what he's going to do with the person who falls in the trap. Even if they're a murderer, he's like, I don't know. So the other things that I've noticed, and there are a few funny ones. One that I've really noticed is foreigners are almost always the murderers and are always ruffians and terrible. If they're from America, watch out. If they're from Australia, also watch out. They're probably vicious killers. I guess Arthur Conan Doyle did not like the English-speaking people. There isn't a ton of racial politics in this. There aren't a lot of people of color in these stories. I guess you could say what you want about that, but they're neither portrayed bad or good. But people from other European countries and other English-speaking countries, especially people from other English-speaking countries that aren't England, are almost always the murderer or the culprit or just bad or even badass. Like an example in The Dancing Man, the Dancing Men, the woman in the story sort of who's it's centered around, she's from America. She's not the murderer, but her husband-ish person from America is, and he's like a Chicago gangster. So according to Arthur Conan Doyle, all Americans are basically murderers, gangsters, or ex-Mormons trying to get revenge. The other thing is, and this is probably wouldn't play well at all nowadays, which is a good thing because we like our veterans, especially our veterans of foreign wars. If you have been stationed in India, Afghanistan, with the exception of John Watson, almost everyone else who comes back from war, also terrible, evil killers that shoot people. The first story in this set of books, in the Return of Sherlock Holmes, is about a veteran who was a sniper basically, and he's just running around killing people. But then there's a few other, and I'll talk about my favorite one in a minute, and my favorite story from this collection, and they're all veterans too. So Arthur Conan Doyle, I don't know what happened with him and veterans. It's funny because John Watson is a veteran of a foreign war, but maybe he's not quite a soldier, so maybe Arthur Conan Doyle didn't like soldiers. You know, John Watson's a doctor, and I don't know what happened. Maybe he got punched in the face by a soldier at a pub one time, and he's like, you know what, I'll show them. But yeah, if the characters in the beginning of the story, generally speaking, are from a different English-speaking country, you can almost guarantee that that's going to be your culprit. If they're a veteran, you can definitely guarantee that they're the culprit and that the story is going to be particularly bloody. The other thing is women are generally safe in these stories. They are rarely the culprit. It almost never happens. And when they are the culprit, it's sort of like by accident. The sexual politics were different then. Women faint a lot in these stories, so he doesn't portray women as like this strong sex. But I mean, he's not overly like misogynistic. It's just the time was different, and I think women were probably a little different. I think if things aren't expected from you, you're not expected. So you will swoon if people aren't like toughen up a little bit. So a lot of swooning by women. and not so much murdering, which I don't know. I guess you could say that's a good thing, but there's a certain weakness that's put to women in these stories. But the other thing is women are rarely the murder victims. Sometimes they are the victims. In my favorite story, again, I'm going to go into The Solitary Cyclist. The woman is definitely a victim. She's almost a victim of rape and then of this weird forced marriage, which is actually, it comes out funny. It would be traumatizing to go through, but women are generally not killed. In The Dancing Men, a woman shot and her husband shot. Her husband's dead, and she makes like a full recovery and then works for orphans or something like that. But it's generally speaking, there isn't a ton of violence done towards women in these stories, which is nice. It limits the stories, and when you see a woman in the story, you feel kind of safe for her. Now, I haven't read all the stories, so maybe a hammer really does drop when they kill a woman. It might be shocking and jarring. I'm sure there are some victims of murder that are women. I just can't think of any from all the stories I've read, which makes me think that it hasn't happened yet. Because I think I would take note of it. I'd have to go back and like reread all 37, and this podcast would never come out. So, you know, if a woman is murdered in a Sherlock Holmes story and you know about it, please email the show and let me know that it did happen, in fact, in one of the stories that I'm missing. So with the exception of like Eileen Adler and some of the other stories like the Second Stain, which is the last one in The Return of Sherlock Holmes, the women are generally not the perpetrators, and even when they are the perpetrators, they're not committing murder. They're like committing mail fraud or, you know, blackmailing someone. So the women generally do not commit heinous crimes in this story. I don't know if that's sexist or not. Like, we want more women murderers represented in your stories, Arthur Conan Doyle, but that's something else you'll notice as a trend. And there was one particular story, the Dancing Men, which I really liked. That's a cool little short story. You think the woman's dead, and this is when I noticed it. When she makes like a full recovery, you're like, oh, I don't think he kills women. And I kind of think also in the time, it may have been shocking to do that. I'm sure it happens. I knew like Frankenstein murders a woman or two, and that was Frankenstein came out well before this the Sherlock Holmes series. So it probably wasn't that shocking, but it seems like Arthur Conan Doyle, for whatever reason, avoided that. The other thing I kind of want to address is the Sherlock Holmes characterization. I feel like, and this is the thing, Benedict Cumberbatch is a great Sherlock, and I really appreciate him. When I watch the show, he gets the characterization a little long. I believe it's Benjamin Bratt who does it, or Brett does the 1984 version. I think he does a more faithful Sherlock Holmes, but they also play it in the time period Sherlock Holmes is from. And to get Sherlock Holmes in the modern day, you probably have to change his character a little bit. So that's why Benjamin, I keep calling him Benjamin Cumberbatch. I'm very sorry. Benedict Cumberbatch does it the way he does. And it's interesting. We're going to get into this. Sherlock Holmes isn't Spock, though. And that's sort of how they play him up. I've seen a few references, and like the show Monk is sort of a Sherlock Holmes homage, if not ripoff. I'm going to say homage. I like the show, and the writers seem nice, and homage is a nicer way to say ripoff. But he's not Spock. And it's funny, Benedict Cumberbatch is in a Star Trek movie, and he plays Khan. You know, he would have been a perfect Spock, though. I don't know if he quite has the look, but he's got that emotionless acting down really well. And he's a great actor, but he plays like a very stern, serious, not overly emotional character. And that's the Sherlock Holmes he plays in that Sherlock series, which again, I just love, but it's not quite what Sherlock Holmes is. Sherlock Holmes isn't like a dick, and he's not like completely emotionless. He's not lovey-dovey or touchy-feely, but he's very, he's kind of normal. Like, he has normal emotional reactions to things. He doesn't seem to be overly into, like, getting married, so he's like a full-time bachelor, which I guess was weird at the time, but it doesn't make him a Iceman. So I've never quite understood that illustration of Sherlock Holmes, especially reading these stories. You really get a human sort of element of Sherlock Holmes. I also like that sometimes Sherlock Holmes is wrong, but my favorite thing is that it happens in a few stories, is Sherlock Holmes is, like, late to the party. Again, and I've referenced these two stories in The Dancing Men, The Adventure of the Dancing Men, and The Solitary Cyclist, is that he's late. Like, he'll be like, I guess we'll go tomorrow. I think something bad might happen tonight. Also, it happens in the 5 Pips, the 5 Orange Pips, where Sherlock Holmes is sort of like, well, it seems like these people are in danger, but I'm kind of busy. So, and maybe this is where his cold-heartedness comes from, but he's upset when he's late. I mean, he can't be everywhere all the time, and he's got to formulate plans, and sometimes these people come to him a day too late, and then they end up dead, and he's like, well, I wish I could have prevented that, but I guess we'll just get him justice instead. I mean, it almost happens in The Hounds of Baskerville. He's like, I think something's going to happen in the next few days, but he's not psychic either, so he gets things wrong, and his timing will sometimes be wrong, and those little things make him a more interesting character, and I really do like that sometimes Arthur Conan Doyle will put that into stories where it's like, oh, the crime wasn't prevented by Sherlock Holmes. He knew about it. He kind of had a feeling it was going to happen soon, but didn't know exactly when. And he couldn't just sit outside the people's door. He came late. The people are dead. And now he's got to investigate it. He's kind of bummed about it, but what are you going to do? Sort of thing about him. So it is good. It mixes up the stories. It makes you feel a little danger. If Sherlock Holmes comes and saves the day every time, the stories would get more boring, and you just feel like, okay, I know what's going to happen here each time. But when someone dies unexpectedly, and like Sherlock's on the case, but he's not there quick enough, it shocks you a little bit, and it makes the stories more fun. Because no one really dies. We're talking about fictional characters, and so I'm not rooting for people to actually get murdered. I don't find that fun. But in a Sherlock Holmes murder mystery, it is fun. The other thing I like about Sherlock Holmes, and there's a lot of different stories. I think I've talked about The House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz. It's a great homage to Sherlock Holmes. It's a Sherlock Holmes story, just not by Arthur Conan Doyle. And the one thing that John Watson, as if he's a real person, the one thing Arthur Conan Doyle does with John Watson's writings, especially at the beginning and end of the story, and usually it's at the beginning, like the first few lines, he opens the door for like fan fiction, which I kind of like. I think fan fiction's fun and interesting, and sometimes it can be really well written. I don't peruse it, and I'm not a like weirdo about it, but sometimes it can be interesting. And the thing with Sherlock Holmes is John Watson will write in the beginning like, oh, there's so many cases that we solved and didn't solve, but this is one that's really special. And then he'll go into the story, but it makes it so if you wanted to write a Sherlock Holmes story, if you were an author like Anthony Horowitz, or if you were just some guy who felt like writing it, it's cool that the door's left open and that there's all these Sherlock Holmes stories out there that we just don't know about, and hey, if you want, you can write them. So I appreciate that. I just think it's cool, and I've thought about maybe after doing this, when I finish the books, maybe doing a little Sherlock Holmes short story for fun to get the creative juices flowing, but I'm not sure yet, but I'm looking into it, and I just like that Arthur Conan Doyle, and I'm not sure if he did it on purpose or just it's a literary device to just show, hey, Sherlock Holmes has all these great stories, but he's done so much more than this, and it makes Sherlock Holmes a more imposing figure and someone that you're in awe of because, oh, look, he's solved all these mysteries. So the last thing I just wanted to say was I love The Solitary Cyclist. I may talk about it in more depth later on. The show's gone a little long, but I love talking about Sherlock Holmes. This has been such a fun experience, and again, I really think it's totally worth a read if you want to read a few of his stories or listen to a few of his stories with Audible or whatever. The short stories are great. The novels are great. Arthur Conan Doyle's a really good writer, and I know he got a little tired of Sherlock Holmes. At the end of Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, he kills him off, and then the Return of Sherlock Holmes, obviously he returns. I don't know if I'm spoiling that it seems like common knowledge, but so and there's a lot of writing out there that Arthur Conan Doyle got tired of this character and wanted to write out other things, and wrote a lot of other things that were very popular and did different series and all that. It's just this is his most well-known stuff, and I think he is generally a good writer, and I may read more of his material after doing this project. But The Solitary Cyclist is so great. It's creepy. It's scary. It's got a female victim, which is not something I'm necessarily rooting for, but it just makes it more interesting. And the ending is, it's not funny. Like it's a little jarring, but there is sort of a women's right message at the end of it that you would think would be obvious to us now, but you don't know the rules back then. About marriage, and can you like trick someone into marrying you without her consent? And it's just it very quickly is like the plan is convoluted, and that's what's funny, because the crime is scary, but the plan after the crime is convoluted. Now I'll just say that The Solitary Cyclist is totally just worth a read, and I don't want to spoil it because it's too good of a story. The ending is too funny and just weird. So thanks for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. And I think The Valley of Fear is the next one, and I hear it's a pretty good novel. It's going to be a Sherlock Holmes novel, and then there's 2 more short story collections. We'll see how I get through them. All right, well, thanks for listening.